He annoys me. I want him to leave.
As you wish, madam, but allow me to show my worth first.
Sometimes the greatest loyalty comes from those we dismiss as worthless. Have you ever underestimated someone only to discover too late how valuable they truly were? That sinking feeling when you realize your judgment was clouded by pride or prejudice, and now what you discarded may have been your greatest treasure. The year was 1852, and the Grand Wiltshire plantation stretched across the fertile lowlands of South Carolina. The main house stood proud against the horizon, its white columns gleaming in the southern sun, while the surrounding fields buzzed with the constant movement of enslaved laborers. The air carried the mingled scents of jasmine and sweat, of wealth built upon broken bodies. Here, in this world of stark contrasts, lived Augustus Wiltshire, the third-generation owner of the estate, a man known for his shrewd business acumen and quick temper. The plantation had prospered under his watch, expanding its cotton production year after year, but rumors whispered that his gambling habits threatened to undo generations of wealth. Among the dozens of enslaved people working the fields was Solomon, a man in his 40s whose hunched posture and slight limp made him appear older than his years. Solomon had not always been at Wiltshire. He had been purchased just 6 months prior from a neighboring plantation whose owner had fallen into debt. Unlike most of the field hands, Solomon could read and write, having secretly learned from the previous master's young daughter before she was sent away to school. He kept this knowledge hidden, understanding well the punishment that would follow if discovered. Solomon walked with a permanent limp from a previous beating. His back carried a constellation of scars, yet his eyes remained clear and observant. He watched everything while appearing to see nothing. In contrast to Solomon stood Marcus, the plantation overseer and a former slave himself. Marcus had earned his freedom through years of loyal service to the Wiltshire family, betraying planned escapes and identifying troublemakers among the enslaved community. His position granted him a small cabin at the edge of the property, fine clothes, and authority over those who had once been his equals. Marcus wielded his power with calculated cruelty, ensuring the enslaved people feared him even more than they feared Augustus Wiltshire himself. His face remained expressionless as he ordered punishments, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, even when commanding the most severe beatings. The summer heat had settled over the plantation, making the air thick and oppressive. Augustus Wiltshire paced the veranda of his grand house, sweat beading on his forehead despite the shade. A letter had arrived that morning bearing the seal of a Charleston bank, and its contents had left him pale and agitated. 3 consecutive bad investments had depleted his reserves, and the bank was calling in loans that he had no means to repay. Bankruptcy loomed on the horizon, threatening to strip away not just his wealth, but the Wiltshire name that had commanded respect throughout the state for generations. He needed money, and he needed it quickly. Marcus observed his master's distress from a distance, his mind calculating what this might mean for his own position. If the plantation changed hands, his arrangement might not be honored by a new owner. He approached Augustus cautiously, offering his usual blend of deference and advice. Augustus regarded Marcus with sudden interest. Yes, Marcus had proven his loyalty many times over. Perhaps he could be trusted with a delicate matter. Augustus beckoned Marcus closer and lowered his voice as he explained his predicament and a potential solution. There were whispers of a hidden cache of gold, supposedly buried by a French merchant during the Revolutionary War, somewhere on the neighboring Beaumont property. The Beaumonts had searched for years without success, but Augustus believed he had deciphered the location from old maps and letters in his family's possession. He needed someone to slip onto the property undetected and retrieve the treasure. Marcus would be too recognizable, but perhaps one of the slaves could be used for this purpose. Marcus thought for a moment before suggesting Solomon. The man was new enough that few outside the plantation would recognize him, and he seemed intelligent despite his efforts to hide it. Moreover, his apparent physical limitations would make him seem unthreatening if spotted. Augustus agreed, though with visible disdain. Solomon was indeed one of the most unremarkable slaves on the property, practically invisible, perfect for such a task. Solomon was brought from the fields to the main house, his eyes downcast as Marcus explained that he was being given a special assignment. Augustus barely glanced at Solomon as he outlined the task at hand, unable to hide his contempt for the hunched figure before him. Solomon was to slip away that night, make his way to the Beaumont property, locate a particular ancient oak described in the documents, and dig for a small chest supposedly buried among its roots. He was to return before dawn with whatever he found. Success would be rewarded, failure would be punished severely. Throughout the explanation, Solomon kept his expression carefully blank, though his mind raced. This was an opportunity, though fraught with danger. If caught trespassing on another plantation, he would likely be killed on sight. If he attempted to escape, Marcus and the hunting dogs would track him down, yet being sent alone, away from the watchful eyes of the overseers, presented possibilities. When dismissed, Solomon shuffled away, his posture revealing nothing of his thoughts. I want to pause this story for a moment to ask you directly. When was the last time you trusted someone and felt that stab in your chest, that silent warning that something wasn't right? I know you may never have shared this with anyone. It's that pain we keep, thinking no one will understand. But here in this space we're creating together, your experience matters. If you've felt this silent betrayal, leave in the comments just the words "I recognize this feeling," and see how many people share this invisible wound. Your comment could be the first step for someone to realize they're not alone on this journey. Let's continue the story now, but carrying this reflection with us. As darkness fell, Solomon slipped away from the slave quarters, a small shovel concealed under his ragged shirt. His limp seemed less pronounced as he moved through the shadows, his posture straighter than anyone at Wiltshire had ever seen. He navigated by starlight, moving through familiar woods that separated the two plantations. Solomon had more knowledge of these lands than Augustus realized. During his short time at Wiltshire, he had listened carefully to the stories told by older slaves, learning the landscape and its secrets. He knew of the underground network that helped enslaved people escape north. He knew which white families might turn a blind eye to a runaway, and which would shoot on sight. And he knew exactly where the old oak stood on Beaumont land, for it was a landmark mentioned in whispered conversations about routes to freedom. Solomon reached the ancient oak without incident, its massive branches spread against the night sky like reaching fingers. He began to dig carefully among its roots in the exact spot Augustus had described. The soil was hard, but Solomon worked methodically, all senses alert for any sign of danger. After an hour of digging, his shovel struck something solid. With increasing urgency, he cleared away the dirt to reveal a small metal box, green with age but intact. Solomon opened it with trembling hands. Inside lay several gold coins and a folded document written in French, which Solomon could not read but recognized as important by its official seals. He held the box in his hands, feeling its weight. This was enough wealth to buy freedom for several people. It was the key to a new life, far from the cruelty of Wiltshire plantation. For a long moment, Solomon contemplated simply disappearing into the night, following the secret paths to the north with this treasure. But something held him back. Not loyalty to Augustus, certainly, but thoughts of the others left behind at Wiltshire. If Augustus fell into financial ruin, all the enslaved people would be sold off, families separated, perhaps to face even worse conditions elsewhere. "The devil you know," as they whispered among themselves. Solomon made his decision. He replaced the box in the hole, covering it with just enough soil to conceal it but make it easy to retrieve later. Then he continued deeper into Beaumont land, toward a small cabin he knew was occupied by Elijah, a free black man who worked as a message carrier between plantations and was known to sympathize with the abolitionist cause. Solomon had never spoken with Elijah before, but he had heard his name mentioned in hushed conversations among the eldest slaves. Elijah was initially suspicious of the nighttime visitor, but Solomon quickly explained his situation and his discovery. Together they formulated a plan. Solomon would return to Wiltshire with information about the treasure, but not the treasure itself. He would tell Augustus that he had found the location, but needed proper tools to extract the heavy chest. Meanwhile, Elijah would contact trusted allies who could put the gold to use funding the Underground Railroad. Dawn was approaching as Solomon made his way back to Wiltshire Plantation. He deliberately dirtied his hands and clothes to show evidence of digging and practiced the story he would tell. As expected, Augustus was waiting impatiently, Marcus at his side. Solomon kept his eyes lowered as he reported finding the treasure site, but explained that the chest was larger than expected and wedged between heavy roots. He needed a proper saw and stronger digging tools, and perhaps another pair of hands. Augustus was visibly agitated but also excited. The treasure was real. He ordered Marcus to prepare the necessary tools and to personally accompany Solomon the following night. Marcus regarded Solomon with suspicion. The slave's story seemed convenient, and there was something different about his demeanor. Still, the prospect of finding treasure overrode his concerns. Augustus, meanwhile, could already feel his financial troubles dissipating. He ordered Solomon locked in a storage room for the day, provided with food and water, but kept isolated to ensure he couldn't share his discovery with anyone else. As Solomon sat alone in the dim room, he contemplated the next phase of the plan. Marcus would be a dangerous companion, far more observant and suspicious than Augustus. But Solomon had anticipated this and had discussed with Elijah how to handle the overseer. Everything depended on the next night's expedition. When darkness fell again, Marcus unlocked the storage room and led Solomon out carrying a bag of tools. Augustus watched them leave from the veranda, resisting the urge to accompany them himself. His presence would only draw unwanted attention if they were spotted. Marcus kept a pistol visible at his waist and walked slightly behind Solomon, making it clear that any attempt to escape would be met with immediate consequences. They reached the ancient oak without incident, and Solomon led Marcus to the spot where he had dug the previous night. The partial excavation was visible, lending credibility to Solomon's story. Marcus ordered Solomon to continue digging while he held a small lantern. Solomon worked steadily, aware of Marcus's eyes constantly on him. When he judged the moment right, Solomon's shovel struck the metal box with an audible clang. Marcus pushed Solomon aside eagerly, dropping to his knees to clear away the remaining dirt with his hands. His usual composure slipped as the box became visible. Solomon stood back, watching carefully as Marcus lifted the box and opened it. The overseer's face transformed with naked greed as he beheld the gold coins gleaming in the lantern light. What happened next occurred so quickly that later Solomon himself could hardly piece together the sequence of events. Marcus's expression shifted from greed to calculation. He turned to Solomon with cold eyes and said quietly that this treasure would be their secret. Augustus need never know. They would hide the gold, report finding nothing, and Marcus would retrieve it later. Once the disappointed master had given up the search, Solomon would be rewarded with better treatment, perhaps even special privileges. The unspoken implication hung in the air. Refuse, and Marcus would ensure Solomon did not return to the plantation alive. Before Solomon could respond, shadows moved among the trees. 3 men emerged into the small clearing, one of them Elijah. They had been waiting as planned. Marcus reached for his pistol, but Solomon was faster, driving the shovel handle into Marcus's stomach, doubling him over. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the ground as the men overwhelmed the overseer, binding and gagging him. Elijah thanked Solomon for his part in the plan. Not only had they secured funds for the Underground Railroad, but they had also removed a notorious slave catcher from the equation. Marcus had been responsible for the capture of over a dozen escaped slaves in the past 2 years, returning them to horrific punishments. Now he would face a different kind of justice. The men would take him north, far from South Carolina, where he would be put to work in a sympathetic farmer's fields, experiencing the same labor he had overseen so cruelly. As for Solomon, he had a choice to make. He could go with them, following the Underground Railroad to freedom in the north or even to Canada. Or he could return to Wiltshire with a fabricated story of being attacked, Marcus killed or captured by unknown assailants, and the treasure lost. Elijah warned that returning was dangerous. Augustus would be furious at the loss of both his overseer and his anticipated treasure. Solomon would likely face suspicion and possibly punishment, but Solomon had made his decision long before this moment. He would return, not out of loyalty to Augustus Wiltshire, but out of commitment to those still enslaved at the plantation. With Marcus gone and Augustus facing financial ruin, opportunities might arise to help others escape. Solomon had connections now, knowledge of the secret networks. He could serve as a link in the chain leading to freedom. Solomon returned to Wiltshire Plantation alone as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. His clothes were torn, his face bruised from self-inflicted wounds to support his story. He collapsed dramatically at the edge of the property, where field hands preparing for the day's work discovered him and brought him to the main house. Augustus Wiltshire was beside himself with rage as Solomon recounted a tale of ambush by armed men who seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. Marcus had fought bravely, Solomon claimed, but was overwhelmed and taken away with the treasure. Solomon himself had been beaten and left for dead, managing to crawl back only through sheer determination. As he told the story, Solomon maintained the same hunched posture and downcast eyes that had caused Augustus to dismiss him as worthless. But beneath this exterior, his mind was already mapping out connections and possibilities, identifying which slaves might be ready to attempt escape, which ones could be trusted with the truth. In the weeks that followed, Augustus Wiltshire's financial situation deteriorated rapidly. Unable to repay his loans, he was forced to sell off parcels of land, and eventually many of his slaves. Solomon, considered of little value due to his apparent physical limitations, was among the last to be sold, purchased for a pittance by a Quaker family with abolitionist leanings, a connection arranged through Elijah's network. Within a month, Solomon was helping to guide others along the Underground Railroad, his knowledge of plantation operations, and his ability to move unnoticed, making him an invaluable asset to the cause of freedom. Years later, after the Civil War had ended and slavery was abolished, a gray-haired Solomon returned to South Carolina. The once grand Wiltshire plantation had fallen into disrepair, the fields untended, the main house occupied by a northern businessman who had purchased the property for a fraction of its former value. Augustus Wiltshire had died penniless, his contempt for those he enslaved having blinded him to the resourcefulness and humanity of the very people he considered property. The servant he had dismissed as annoying and worthless had ultimately played a key role in his downfall, not through violence or direct confrontation, but through the quiet resistance of a man who refused to surrender his dignity or abandon his fellow sufferers. The true worth of a person can never be measured by their status or appearance, nor by the judgments of those who claim ownership over others. It lies in the choices they make when faced with injustice, in their capacity for compassion even in the darkest circumstances, and in their unwavering commitment to the inherent freedom that belongs to every human being. The story of Solomon reminds us that throughout the brutal history of slavery, resistance took many forms, from open rebellion to subtle subversion, and that the human spirit cannot truly be enslaved, even when the body is in chains. If these stories of courage and betrayal during the slavery era touch your heart as they touch mine, I invite you to join our community. By subscribing to the channel, you'll have access to carefully researched stories that reveal long-hidden truths about our past, helping to understand wounds that still echo in our society. It's not just about knowing history, but about honoring the memory of those who lived these realities. Click subscribe and let's journey together in discovery and reflection.